This is the America's Quarterly Podcast. I'm Brian Winter. Voters throughout Latin America are craving solutions to the spread of organized crime. On today's episode, we'll look at how some politicians around the region are eager to replicate Nayib Bukele's crackdown on gangs in El Salvador, and why doing so might be more difficult than it seems.
I think the bottom line is that wherever crime makes the lives of hundreds of thousands of people a nightmare, there will continue to be broad public demand for manuelismo.
It's a story we all think we know. El Salvador, plagued by one of the world's highest murder rates, has enough and elects a leader in Nayib Bukele, who then consolidates power, incarcerates more than 1% of the population, and rules under a state of emergency. And it works. Homicide rates plummet dramatically, at an extremely high cost to civil liberties and democratic institutions, but it works. So many people in the region and elsewhere in the world are now talking about him, with many voters in places like Ecuador, Peru, Argentina, Chile, saying, we'd like a Nayib Bukele in our country too. On today's episode, we want to really dive into this story of Bukelismo and to what extent it's spreading in Latin America, looking at some aspects of the story in El Salvador that not everybody knows, and also wrestling with some of the tough questions about the region's current surge in organized crime. Our guest today has spent a lot of time thinking about these questions. Manuel Meléndez-Sánchez is a doctoral candidate in government at Harvard University. He co-wrote with Alberto Vergara a recent article in the Journal of Democracy. It's entitled, "The Bukele Model, Will It Spread?" Manuel, welcome to the AQ Podcast.
Thank you, Brian. It's great to be here.
Manuel, let me start with a general question. In your experience, what do most people elsewhere in Latin America fundamentally misunderstand about Nayib Bukele and what has happened in El Salvador?
I think there are two big misconceptions about Bukele and his security model. The first is this idea that the model, that these policies, that they work because they are so intensive and because they sort of overwhelm criminal groups. And this is a big part of the story. But in fact, there are also lots of other factors that make this play out. The biggest one is this pact between criminal groups and the state that happens right before. But I guess the point is that this is actually a very complicated process. It's a process that kind of depends on the specific set of circumstances and actors. And the misconception here is this oversimplification, right? Declare war on criminal groups, fight them with absolutely no restraint, and we will be able to eliminate them.
So you'd say that the story was more complicated, that it was not just a question of Bukele pounding the table and deciding one day that he was going to unleash the full fury of the Salvadoran state and security forces on the MS-13 and these other gangs. So what were the key elements then that let him enjoy this success that he's had?
This turns out actually to be a fairly complicated explanation. And I think it helps if we take a step back and we think about why sort of repression usually doesn't work when we're trying to tackle crime. Of course, Bukele is not the first person in Latin America to implement manuelismo. I mean, this is a region that has a shorthand for crackdowns against crime, right? It's manuelismo. And we know that virtually all of these exercises in cracking down on criminal groups, they fail, if not backfire. And there's kind of two reasons for this. The first is that when the state declares unconditional war on crime, criminal groups obviously have an incentive to fight back. And so what you end up with is more violence, not less. This is, for instance, a great description of what happened in Mexico in the mid-2000s when the state declares war on cartels. The second reason, and this one is maybe a little more complicated, but crackdowns tend to change the organization of criminal groups in ways that also make them more violent. So what do I mean by this? This sort of ends up looking a little different in different places. But in El Salvador, for example, the MS-13 and Barrio Ocho and these gangs, they were small, disorganized, sort of relatively nonviolent constellation of little cliques. It is only when the state cracks down on them that it gives them the incentive to sort of come together and to start becoming this formidable force that they later become. In other contexts, what crackdowns create is they actually sort of create more divisions between criminal groups and more fragmentation, but that also tends to lead to more violence and more infighting. And so then the question becomes, okay, well, this is probably the most drastic and intense unconditional crackdown on crime. Why did it work? Why didn't we see these things I've just been talking about? And I would point to two factors. The first, and this is the part that's not really a surprise to anyone, is this idea that the crackdown was and continues to be extraordinarily intensive. It's actually quite hard to wrap your head around just how intensive this has been. So if you compare this crackdown to the Mexican case, for example, probably until recently the most famous example of a state declaring war on criminal groups, and you compare arrest numbers, here are some data points on that. So in the first sort of 43 months of Calderon's war on drugs, Mexican authorities conducted more than 120,000 arrests. And compared to Mexico's population, that's about 107 arrests for every 100,000 Mexicans. So that's 107 for every 100,000 Mexicans. Meanwhile, in the first 24 months of Bukele's crackdown, so in about half as long as Mexico, Salvadoran authorities conducted about 1,221 arrests for every 100,000 Salvadorans. It's basically a full order of magnitude above Mexico. This is equivalent to jailing about 1% of the country's population in a span of a couple of years. The scale of the crackdown is really unprecedented.
So I guess what you're saying here is when Bukele did it, he engaged in a crackdown. He didn't go halfway, I guess would be one way of putting it. He really went after it. But there's another element that you touch on in your article, which I interpreted as kind of a strategic miscalculation by the gang leaders that was, in your view, just as important as the scale of the crackdown that Bukele led.
Absolutely. And look, the intensity of the crackdown plays a huge role, but it's not the whole story. And here's the smoking gun. Here's how you know there's more to this. Remember what I mentioned earlier about why these crackdowns fail? They fail because gangs fight back. And if you look at the Salvadoran case, there is absolutely no evidence that there was any resistance from criminal groups whatsoever. And it's possible that the crackdown was so intense that it would have defeated the criminal groups anyway. But the kind of key question here is, why is there no effort at all? There is kind of a narrative that's taken hold since the crackdown, which is, the Salvadoran gangs were fairly weak. These aren't, the Mexican cartels. These aren't Ecuadorian criminal groups.
And there's truth to that, though, right? I mean, the MS-13 did not have the massive revenues from cocaine that, say, the Clan del Golfo or some of the groups in Colombia do. But you're saying there's more to the story.
These are not as wealthy or well-armed, but everything is relative, right? The Salvadoran state is not as strong as, for example, the Mexican state. And if you kind of just look at the record of El Salvador kind of in the 10 years leading up to this, it's clear that these are criminal groups that have the ability to bring this country to its knees. And so the question is, if that's the case, why do they not resist this even a little bit? I'm not exaggerating, Brian. There isn't a shred of evidence that faced with this existential threat, the gangs try to resist it, try to do something about it. Alberto Vergara and I argue that a big part of this has to do with a pact. Between 2019, late 2019, 2020, and the beginning of the state of exception, Bukele negotiated with the gangs in exchange for keeping violence down, and in exchange for some electoral favors, and in exchange for some access to territory. The government offered gangs a number of goodies and benefits, from better conditions in prison to protection from extradition and things of that nature. We know about this from great investigative journalism, always a shout out to the folks at El Faro, but also from U.S. court documents. There is There's some information coming out now from a case against MS-13 leaders up in Europe. But anyway, so this pact is in place. And for about 2 years, this pact works. It helps keep violence down. And eventually the pact breaks down. And this is when Bukele decides to launch the state of exception. But okay, the pact does two things that help explain why the gangs don't fight back once the crackdown comes. The first is that the pact decimates the gang's ability to formulate a strategic response. So let me tell you what I mean by this. Fighting back against the state and doing so effectively requires some coordination. It requires these complex criminal organizations to agree on a response. It requires leadership. It requires all sorts of things. This stuff doesn't just happen. These negotiations with the government over 2 years, a little bit more than that, they drive a wedge between gang leadership and gang rank and file. And this turns out to be crucial later on. So an interesting characteristic of the Salvadoran gangs, which a lot of people might not be aware of, is that its leaders actually long operated from behind bars, while its sort of rank and file was in the streets. During the pact with Bukele, a lot of the direct benefits from the pact went to these gang leaders who were in prison. Meanwhile, it was the rank and file who sort of had to pay the price. The price here is basically refraining from using violence. And this is pretty costly, right? It makes it harder to extort, which is sort of what you do for a living. It makes it harder to settle scores. It makes it harder to resist arrest, all sorts of things. So what the leaders do to sort of avoid losing control of their rank and file in the streets is they basically centralize power. Historically, these leaders would appoint lieutenants who were in the streets, and they served as representatives. What the leaders do over this pact period is that they begin to remove these lieutenants. They begin to basically govern the rank and file directly. Why is this important? Because it means that when the crackdown comes, the government is able to decapitate these criminal groups very quickly by simply isolating or removing from the board a small number of leaders who were in prison. And so the rank and file is left completely leaderless and completely alone. If you think about, for instance, the decapitation strategies in Mexico, these cartels were different in terms of actually having lieutenants. They had levels of leadership. They had tiers of leadership. And so part of what happens in Mexico, right, is you decapitate the head, but you have very capable, very ambitious lieutenants who are then able to kind of, in the Mexican case, kind of like fight it out for control. Here, there's nothing, right? There's no middle management because the leaders have deliberately kind of hollowed out the structure of the criminal groups.
So, Manuel, you mentioned that there were two main elements. What's the other one?
Sure. The second element is that it changes beliefs among gang members about what they have to gain by fighting back. So the state of exception is declared in March of 2022, immediately after the MS-13, sort of out of the blue, goes on this mass, on this wave of homicides. Now, the key here is to understand that something very similar had happened twice in the 2 years leading up to this. Out of nowhere, one of the gangs goes on a killing spree, and in both of those occasions, what happens? Bukele comes out with Manuel rhetoric. He cracks down on the gangs, but the gangs don't fight back. Leadership says, don't fight back. And within days, homicides go back to kind of this low level from the pact. State repression eases back. Everything goes back to normal. We're back at the negotiation table. The pact sort of survives. And so there is this really interesting learning process, right? Gang members come to believe that this is the script. This is how things work. When this same script sort of plays itself out again in March 2022, it is reasonable to believe that this is exactly kind of the script that many gang members thought was playing out. And because they didn't have any leaders to say this time is different, there was sort of no way to escape this.
They think that they can just lay low for a little while, this will pass, and then business will go back to normal. And they're wrong.
Absolutely, because that's exactly how it's worked for the past 2 years, right?
We'll be back after a short break. The Americas Society Art Gallery in New York City is a spectacular place to see art from Latin America. The gallery is currently showing the city's first ever solo exhibition of the Argentine artist Alejandra Sever. The show features the artist's colorful abstract work, which includes, believe it or not, a mini golf course for visitors to play while looking at the works. The exhibit is on view only until July 27th, 2024, so hurry up and get here. The Americas Society Art Gallery is at 680 Park Avenue in New York. So that takes us to where we are now. I mean, basically, the crackdown is real. The gang leadership and rank and file miscalculate. Homicide rates plummet. By some measures, the homicide rate in El Salvador now is the lowest in the Western Hemisphere, except for Canada. And this model is being looked at by leaders and by voters all over the region. What is it about this story, though, that you've just told us that you think will make Bukelismo, and specifically his security strategy, so difficult to export?
Sure. I think there are two big factors here. The first is the difficulty in replicating the intensity of this. And so here's another myth or misconception about Bukele. Right? The misconception is, hey, this guy pulls off a miracle. He's very successful at defeating the gangs. And then he uses this popularity as an excuse to kind of undermine checks and balances and undermine democracy. It's actually the opposite, right? Long before the state of exception is declared, Bukele has concentrated all power under the executive and undermined checks and balances, fired the Supreme Court, fired the Attorney General. And so what happens is that when he decides to declare all-out war on criminal groups, he has absolutely no institutional, legal, or political checks on how far he can go. Replicating a crackdown of this intensity anywhere else would essentially require that same level of autonomy, right?
Yeah. And a leader a future politician who's listening to this might sort of conclude, oh, well, all I have to do then is come in really strong, consolidate power, dismantle institutions from the beginning. But in my view, and in the view of many others, the institutions of El Salvador were uniquely weak and discredited at the time when Bukele took office. I mean, it's true that democracy is on its back foot in a lot of countries, and polling shows that. But to have been as malleable as they were back when Bukele took office, I mean, that was a pretty unique circumstance, don't you think?
I think that's possible. I think what's definitely true is that it is actually a lot harder to dismantle checks and balances than we tend to think. This isn't as simple as being elected and then wanting to do away with courts and checks and balances.
Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil would agree with you.
Absolutely. And I think if there is sort of one kind of quote unquote magic element here that allows Bukele to kind of do this very effectively, it's his massive popularity, right? His popularity has always kind of floated somewhere between, I mean, at its very lowest, and this is rare, it's been 70%. More often, it's been kind of in the 80s and the mid 80s. And that sort of political capital is very, very difficult to achieve. If you think back to what we just discussed, kind of the conditions created by this pact that essentially interrupt this process of how criminal groups tend to respond to crackdowns, that story is sort of very particular to El Salvador. Right? It relies on the structure of criminal groups. It relies on how this pact worked. It relies on all of these highly contingent factors. And so even if you're able to crack down on crime with a lot of force, if you can't find a way to interrupt this sort of reactive sequence that it sets in place, then you're kind of likely to end up where the conventional wisdom takes you, right? A place of more violence and a place where crime continues to thrive.
So let's look at specific examples that you mentioned in your article. You talked about Honduras and Ecuador as two countries that have tried to emulate some aspects of what Bukele had done. And you talk about why they have, at least so far, fallen short.
There's an important disclaimer here, which is that talking about kind of emulation or diffusion is a very tricky thing. For instance, I think that Ecuador would look essentially the same right now in a world where Bukele doesn't exist. And I think, it's likely that in Honduras, Xiomara Castro would have at some point kind of taken this kind of manuelista turn. So first of all, I don't want to overclaim and say, hey, this is Novoa and Castro kind of copying the Bukele model. I do think the model kind of does two things, right? Number one, it I think helps legitimize these mano dura policies, right? Ecuador and especially Honduras are places where Bukele is extremely popular. And so it kind of lays the groundwork for kind of the public in some ways kind of accepting these crackdowns. And number two, as you sort of suggested there, it does kind of provide some formulas or kind of some elements to borrow from. Probably the most notable is this idea of building mega prisons, right? Both Novoa and Castro have proposed and apparently are building huge mega prisons kind of inspired by Bukele's terrorism confinement center. And the results, I think, have been mixed in both of these cases. Neither of these crackdowns has sort of eliminated criminal groups as sort of at all, really, and certainly not as swiftly and as decisively as in El Salvador. I think this is a function of two things. I think, number one, in both of these cases, the crackdowns have been much more limited, right? And this is a pretty stunning thing that's worth thinking about. We have to remember in sort of January of this year, Ecuador was a country that looked like it was about to fall apart. If there is ever a situation in which we might expect the president to be able to have sort of complete autonomy to address the crisis of crime, that situation would look something like Ecuador. But even in that context, Novoa faces serious constraints, right? There are legal constraints on how far he can go, and these constraints are kind of enforced. There are institutional constraints that have to do with sort of the capacity of the armed forces and so on. But the point is, neither one of these crackdowns really gets anywhere near the intensity of the Bukele crackdown. And the second thing is, in both of these cases, criminal groups essentially respond the way we would expect them to respond in a pre-Bukele world. They sort of adapt and adjust wherever possible. In some cases, they kind of move around. They sort of move around in terms of where they get their income from. And where necessary, they double up on violence. And ultimately, they kind of continue to survive.
Manuel, I have wondered if Bukelismo in the end will be kind of in most countries, a shorthand for taking organized crime more seriously. And as you mentioned, implementing some policies like specifically the mega prisons where gang leaders are no longer able to continue to control their criminal enterprises. And the example that has made me wonder about this is not Honduras or Ecuador, but Argentina, where, of course, the Milei government has not only shown an intense interest in the Bukele story, but where officials, including Patricia Bullrich, the security minister, has met with her Salvadoran counterparts. And look, I mean, you talk about a country that has clear democratic and institutional restraints. Argentina is one of those countries in my view. I mean, Argentina is not going to round up 1% of its population over the next 12 months. It's thankfully, in my view, not a country where that can happen. But it is a country where there is a demand for policies that are tougher on crime in response to, in certain areas, particularly Rosario, an increase in homicide rates in recent years. Chile is another case where, the right is leading in polls for the presidential election next year, where crime is the number one issue. Is it possible that at a time when organized crime is clearly making inroads in many countries, in part because the amount of area under cultivation for cocaine has doubled over the last decade, that the real legacy of Bukelismo will not be, some of the details of what Bukele has done, but a commitment by the state to take crime more seriously? What do you think?
A couple of thoughts. First, I think I find it useful to sort of distinguish between kind of two kinds of countries in this region, right? There are the places where crime and organized crime particularly has been kind of a leading issue for some time now, right? These are kind of your Central Americas of the world, of Latin America. This is Mexico and so on. In those places, the appeal of manudurismo has been pretty constant, and I don't think that's going to go away. Then you have a set of countries where crime is becoming more of an issue, both sort of in reality, kind of on the ground, and politically. And I think this is sort of Costa Rica, this is Chile, this is Argentina. And I think those places, my intuition is that these places sort of follow a slightly different logic, where crime has sort of appeared. In some sense, it feels like it has appeared out of nowhere, right? And there is a sense, maybe even a little bit of kind of shock, for lack of a better word, and this kind of reaching about for, okay, what do we do? How do we handle this? And I think absolutely for those countries, for voters in those countries, for leaders in those countries, it's completely natural to kind of look around and go, okay, well, what works? This Bukele model has worked. And to at least pay lip service to the model. But look, I think the bottom line is that wherever crime makes the lives of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people a nightmare, there will continue to be broad public demand for Manuelismo. And so the question of, okay, are we going to sort of see a new kind of Manuelista equilibrium in the region? I think in some ways that might be up to politicians, right? In the sense of, are you able to offer anything else? Are you able to offer an alternative model that persuades voters, that delivers results, that operates within democratic norms and rules, not against them, and that can compete with sort of the classic Manuelista appeal?
Do you see any examples of that around the region right now?
Look, not great ones. Look, this is part of the appeal of the Bukele model, right? I mean, absolutely. I don't think this is a big mystery. We can sort of point to some things. A lot of the things that have seemed promising and that some of us who sort of study this within political science tend to point to, a lot of these things happen actually at the subnational level. And so we often talk, for instance, about, I guess, two sets of things, right? One is this idea of an unconditional crackdown. And this idea of, look, the state says, look, we will crack down on criminal groups, but only if they use violence. And what's sort of interesting about those kinds of models is that they create really strong incentives for criminal groups not to use violence.
I think of Sao Paulo, which had a 80% decline in homicide rates over the last 25 years. The problem with that model, and that's an episode of its own, but there's been constant speculation that there was a formal or informal deal in place between the state government and the PCC, the gang leaders there. And while homicide rates in Sao Paulo are now very low, other kinds of crime are extremely high. And the decision by the authorities to effectively leave the gangs alone have let them move into broad swaths of the economy as well as politics. So it's I guess it reflects the broader contours of this conversation, which is that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't.
Absolutely, right? That's a trade-off. These sort of conditional crackdown strategies, they work to reduce violence, but the trade-off is, in everything else that they do, criminal groups can continue to thrive. And the other problem with them is that they're deeply unpopular. People hate it when their governments negotiate with criminal groups. The sort of other basket of things basically has to do with police reform and with kind of reforming justice systems and with essentially creating more transparent, more accountable, more meritocratic police forces and judicial sectors. There is some pretty good evidence that this works. The problem, and sort of maybe pardon the expression, is that it's completely unsexy. It's you put that in front of voters and you say, we will pass sort of justice sector reform, and it might take us a couple of years for this to pay off. It's a very hard sell. The third strategy, I was recently in Colombia, and I was surprised at how many people said to me, the alternative to the Bukele model is the paz total, right? It's Petro's effort to basically negotiate peace with armed actors in that country. Extremely different circumstances, extremely different set of actors, but at least in principle, this is the alternative on the opposite extreme of Manuelismo. And that is its own kind of worms. I'm not trying to open it. But if you're looking for alternatives, that might be one thing to consider.
Yeah, that strategy has had challenges as well. Manuel, I want to thank you for a very thoughtful conversation on a topic that I know is very complex. It's very front of mind for our audience. I think we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for being with us today on the podcast.
Absolutely, Brian. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the America's Quarterly Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a review, give us a rating, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. The America's Quarterly Podcast is produced and edited by Luisa Franco. Our sound engineer is Gabriela Baez.